Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 5th Annual Pediatric Innovation Showcase, brought to you by Stanford Children's Health and Stanford Medicine. I am Charlotte Stallworth, Vice President of Business Development and Innovation, and my other two hosts would like to introduce themselves as well.
My name is James Wall. I'm a pediatric surgeon here at Stanford Children's Health and help to direct the biodesign program as well as the pediatric health technology program.
Hi, everybody. I'm Natalie Pagler. I'm a pediatric critical care physician, Chief Medical Information Officer for Stanford Children's Health, and the Program Director for the Clinical Informatics Fellowship.
We are so excited to be hosting you again, and this year we are live at Stanford University versus being 100% virtual last year. But we also do have you, our audience, primarily being virtual, and we're going to be bringing you researchers, thought leaders from across the country discussing artificial intelligence and the real-world use of data in pediatric innovation. So we will also be joined by pediatric device innovators on the leading edge of technology, and Dr. James Wall will tell you a little bit more about that.
So I just would like to say this is absolutely my favorite day of the year. It is so invigorating to see all these groups from around the country thinking about pediatric healthcare, health technology, informatics, and how to use it to improve the lives of our patients. So why are we here? We think we need more of that. You know, our best guess is that about 1 in 40 health technologies are specifically designed and developed for children. And we think we should do better. And we're not just on a soapbox telling industry to do better. We're here really trying to build an ecosystem within Stanford where we can help to nurture technologies and help to move them out to the market so they can ultimately impact patients. We do that with the support of a number of sponsors, the FDA through their Pediatric Device Consortium grant, the Cottrell Foundation, the Hooper family, and others. With those resources, we've built a system here where we take early stage ideas and educate principal investigators and entrepreneurs on how to move technologies forward, understanding regulatory barriers, payment barriers, adoption, clinical trials. We then have resources to bring in outside experts to help these groups. And finally, we have today, which is our pitch competition. And in the last 5 years, we've given out over $2 million in seed funding. We've seen over 100 companies from around the country come and apply to this pitch competition. We see the best of the best coming in. And over the years, we've seen over $40 million in follow-on funding to these early stage companies and ultimately seen them affecting tens of thousands of kids' lives. So that's why it's my favorite day. I'm very excited to be here. We do want to thank the AV team. You know, 2 years ago, we were in the position where we completely freaked out and went virtual. We thought that was going to be hard. Now doing it hybrid is even harder. So a big thanks to Gordon and the Stanford video team who are running this live stream. Also big thanks to Josh and the School of Medicine team who are here live. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Natalie for the next part of the session.
Thanks, James. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lloyd Minor, the Carl and Elizabeth Naumann Dean of the Stanford University School of Medicine. Under his leadership, Stanford Medicine has emerged as a leader in the precision health revolution, which emphasizes preventative, personalized healthcare and leverages advances in biomedicine to treat and cure complex diseases. His book, Discovering Precision Health, published in 2020, illustrates how Stanford Medicine and other health leaders are revolutionizing biomedicine. In 2021, he articulated a bold vision for the purposeful and equitable development of a life sciences innovation hub in the Bay Area. Dr. Minor is also a professor of otolaryngology, head and neck surgery, and professor of bioengineering and of neurobiology. With more than 160 published articles and chapters, Dr. Minor is an expert in balance and inner ear disorders. In 2012, he was elected to the National Academy of Medicine, and we're pleased to have him kick off the day today.
Good morning, and welcome from Stanford Medicine. I want to thank Dr. James Wall, Charlotte Stallworth, and Dr. Natalie Pagler for all the critical work they do year-round to improve child and maternal health. and the time they spent organizing this important conference. I deeply appreciate your commitment and dedication. We're all united by a shared mission to accelerate innovation in pediatric therapies and devices. I applaud Stanford Children's Health and the UCSF Stanford Pediatric Device Consortium for their continued leadership. Through the consortium, we build bridges, remove hurdles, and spark innovation. And through events such as this, we share the latest research and thinking, provide encouragement and support, and before it's all over, fund some promising new research. The challenge is as acute as it is stubborn. Untreated illness in children can have profound, lasting consequences. Yet pediatric device development lags behind adult devices by as much as 5 years. Therapies are equally problematic. Look no further than our COVID-19 vaccines, developed for each age group down to 6 years old. Excellent trials, rigorous regulatory process, each approval coming pretty much as expected. Until we got to the very young children. For kids under 5 years old, the clinical trials didn't see the same impressive immune response with the 2-shot regimen. More research was needed. More time was needed. There are so many unique hurdles pediatric device researchers face, from biology we don't fully understand to the challenges of accounting for a growing body. But for each one of these, I see just as many reasons to be optimistic that we can accelerate innovation. The precision health drivers fueling this revolution in biomedicine, big data, AI, digital health technologies, and genomics, are being used for our youngest and most vulnerable patients. With greater emphasis and investment, I hope we can do even more basic and translational research that takes into account the unique challenges of pediatric medicine. I applaud all that you who have dedicated your time to this work, and I wish our pitch competition entrants all the best in this afternoon's judging. Because of the work you and so many others are doing, I'm confident we will fulfill our shared mission of developing cures and effective therapies for childhood illnesses. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. So good morning. I want to extend my welcome. James, you said this is your favorite day of the year. It is my favorite day too, because this is the first time I've been standing in Berg Hall in 2 years. So it's quite thrilling, and I want to extend my thanks and congratulations to Charlotte, Natalie, and James for this very exciting program. So my name's Mary Leonard. I'm chair of the Department of Pediatrics, physician-in-chief of Lucile Packard Children's Hospital, and importantly for this conference, I'm director of the Maternal and Child Health Research Institute, and we are so thrilled by the work that's being done here. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Christopher Forrest, and I have been colleagues. Christopher, I hate to tell you this, but it's been 30 years since we worked together at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So Chris is a professor of pediatrics and healthcare management at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the executive director and the founder of Pedsnet, a national pediatric learning health system, which is one of the PCORNet clinical research networks. It is funded by really a transformative grant from PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. Pedsnet is the only PCORNet network devoted exclusively to pediatric research. The network originally was funded to include 8 pediatric academic health systems, but we were thrilled last year for Stanford and Lucile Packard Children's Hospital to become the 9th member of this consortium, and then I know 3 more have been added just this year. Pedsnet has created an analysis-ready database for more than 12 million children with data from 2009 to the present. It is updated quarterly. We know that now because we send our data quarterly. And it has transformed source institutional electronic health record data into both the Pedsnet and the PCORNet common data models. The network has conducted or is currently supporting more than 100 observational studies and clinical trials that use health provider organizations' standardized EHR data and/or recruit patients from clinical settings. And we here are especially grateful to Stanford School of Medicine research IT team that has made our participation possible, and to MCHRI for funding all the IT and data management costs for participation in Pedsnet. Chris is also the director of the CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Applied Clinical Research Center, which is the institutional home for Pedsnet. He led the development of the AHRQ Learning Health System Scientist Competencies, which serves as the basis for 11 institutional K-12 centers of excellence, one of which he leads, the Pedsnet Scholars. And we are very fortunate that A.R. Bennett, one of our developmental behavioral pediatric fellows, is able to participate in this program. Importantly, Chris served as chair of the executive committee for the NIH PROMISE, which is the Patient-Reported Outcomes Measurement Information System. He led a large pediatric research site for the second phase of the initiative and an NIH award to conduct the clinical validation of PROMISE measures as part of the Patient-Reported Outcomes and Chronic Disease Consortium, which he leads as chair of the steering committee. His research group has developed more than 50 pediatric patient-reported outcome measures, both child self-report and parent proxy versions, and is dedicated to ensuring that PROMISE becomes a standard for assessing children's self-reported health. Finally, he is working with colleagues across the U.S. to catalyze the field of life course health science, which is concerned with how an individual's dynamic interactions with their environment produces health over the lifespan. Chris and I began working on this together more than 10 years ago as part of a CTSA program and is a priority for the Maternal and Child Health Research Institute here and is the foundation for our collaborations with the Department of Epidemiology. So special thanks and welcome to Chris.
I'm really pleased to be with all of you about Pedsnet. This is a program of research that I actually think of more as a campaign. What we're trying to do with now 11 major children's hospitals and health systems is change the way we do pragmatic research. That is, applied clinical research that's useful once the results are made available. So it's not the full spectrum of research. It's some might call, in translational terms, T3, T4 type research, but it uses a particular model. So what I'd like to do today is share with you the model that we use, which is called the Learning Health Systems model, and tell you a little bit about how we went from the concept of the Learning Health System, which was initially championed by the IOM, the National Academy of Medicine, and scaled it to create Pedsnet. Then I'll talk a little bit about the resources that Pedsnet has available, and I'm hoping that through the talk, not only will I share with you what's happening nationally in pediatric applied clinical research, but I'll also stimulate a number of you to start using Pedsnet, because this is a resource that's now available to all Stanford investigators. I'll touch briefly on a few key projects, and then I'll conclude with a bit on training the next generation. So let's start with the concept. The problem that I saw actually as a fellow was that there were a number of pediatric clinical decisions that I and colleagues were making that were based on what we were taught, but not necessarily based on evidence. Work that I did with the NIH concluded that almost half of all US pediatric trials, this is both in the private and public sectors, never publish their results, so they don't conclude. What we found at the NIH was that a lot of pediatric studies that were unable to recruit the adequate numbers of patients were bogged down by protocol complexity. We also saw in work that we did when I was at Johns Hopkins as a junior faculty that half of all medications used in children are not approved by the FDA. They're used off-label, and 90% of all medications for newborns are used off-label. And then the rapid development, dependency of kids on caretakers and the health system, and the different demographics that they have create not a little adult, but actually a unique developmental phase that needs to be addressed in research. So there were all these gaps, there were all these problems in the pediatric evidence base. And what we began to see is that the health system model might actually be the solution to addressing these problems. Through a series of reports that the National Academy issued in 2009, it actually continues to issue, but primarily 2009 to 2014, concept of a learning health system was articulated as a health system at any level of scale. In other words, it could be a physician's primary care practice. It could be a community health center, it could be a public health agency, it could be a large integrated delivery system like Kaiser. But at any scale, a health system becomes a learning health system when it can and continuously and routinely studies itself and improves itself. So the two key issues here are continuous study, that is continuous research, and continuous performance improvement. And that actually creates what we call a virtuous cycle of learning, an afferent arm of research generating new knowledge, populating the knowledge network, and an efferent arm of improvement, bringing that new knowledge back to the point of care and it across pediatrics. And this is a graphic that shows you the concept of the learning cycle in its most mature form. This goes on continuously. So in some ways, what this does on a research perspective is it adds improvement. You're not really done with your project until you take your results and not only dissect them, but implement them back at the point of care. But it also adds to the improvement side, the concept of research. There are some questions that actually benefit from scientific inquiry. So why now? Why is the learning health system model so ripe for dissemination across all of the United States? And actually our vision is to connect all 220 plus pediatric institutions in a infrastructure that allows for continuous learning from each other, not just from each patient, but learning from each institution, and then bringing those learnings back to the point of care. The Better Pharmaceuticals Act for Children, the Pediatric Research Equity Act provided both carrots and sticks to pharma to include children in research studies. The NIH lifespan requirement for research is also helpful, but major investments through the HITECH Act led to rapid adoption about 10 years ago of the electronic health record system, so that now all pediatric institutions are digitized. But importantly, more recently, the FDA through the 21st Century Cures Act, and more recently in 2018, the use of electronic health record data in clinical investigators' guidance has both required the FDA to start figuring out how to use EHR data to extend labeling claims and also provide guidance on how to do so. I'll show you an example of a kind of study that we've done that fits this sort of requirement of taking evidence that exists in adults and then using electronic health record data to replicate those studies, determine whether or not the labeling claim made for adults can be extended to children. So let's talk a little bit about the scaling of Pedsnet. We started with the IOM concept, which we were really quite enamored with. We saw it as a way to not only accelerate knowledge production, but also accelerate the improvement of outcomes of children, families, and health system. So that became the concept. And in 2010, we held a meeting at the IOM and invited 25 pediatric institutions to talk about how to make health systems concept real in pediatrics. There was a lot of enthusiasm for the concept. There wasn't a lot of resources available for implementing the concept. So rather than trying to boil the ocean with all 25 institutions, instead what we did is competed for a grant to build out the prototype of the learning health system model in pediatrics in one disease area, inflammatory bowel disease, with one pediatric subspecialty, pediatric gastroenterology. This was one of those errors. So it was a $12 million grant. And we learned a lot about how to conduct comparative effectiveness research using real world data. We learned a lot about how to address the regulatory barriers to sharing data and so on. And from those learnings, we brought 8 institutions back together and we took learnings, the prototype, and started to scale it across a number of institutions that became Pedsnet. And now Pedsnet, you'll see, is expanded. Pedsnet is primarily 11 institutions now, but the patients are from all over the country. You know, our pediatric referral centers are really national in scope, but this is a heat map of where the patients are located. The H's are the hospitals. Stanford is a recent member, but there are actually newer members. Children's National has just joined. Texas Children's Hospital has joined, Indiana University and Riley Children's has joined. And we see a number of other institutions gearing up to join that as well. Because I think there's a clear vision here of creating a national cyber social infrastructure that connects us to rapidly learn from each other and then to learn across the nation and then administer those improvements in our knowledge into the point of care locally. These are our current database, which actually is housed, it's a centralized repository. It's actually housed at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia currently. It's about 8.5 million children with data from 2009 to present. But with the addition of the new institutions, will exceed 12 million patients. We have approximately representation of 17,000 pediatric clinicians, 73 community clinics. And any given day, 10% of all US children will be making a visit in a Pedsnet institution. And I anticipate when we see that number rise to 15% or so, we'll reach that inflection point on the adoption curve and start to see rapid acceleration in membership in Pedsnet. So Pedsnet, you can think of as like the Mac operating system for research. We, unlike many other research networks, which may be focused, say, on cardiovascular conditions, we're really about improving outcomes for children. And we're specialty agnostic. What we do is we create a number of resources listed on this slide and make them available to groups that want to conduct a research study. But ideally, we love to see groups organized around a common purpose, i.e. maybe a subspecialty group or a group focused on a particular pediatric problem that wants to self-organize its own governance, its own identity, its own collection of investigators, but leverage the operating system, leverage these resources listed on this slide. We've got social resources by including individuals across each of these institutions who are well connected throughout their organization that we can very rapidly spin up teams if there's a problem. For example, when COVID hit, we spun up a COVID team in a matter of a couple of days. That's a very powerful piece of this. And I'd like to point out that although we have a very extensive technical infrastructure, the most important resource is the first one listed here. It's our social relationships. It's the community that we've built. So one of the big, and actually the most costly resources that we have is our data repository. We bring structured electronic health record data from each institution into a centralized repository. And we centralize this because we believe that the ability to improve the quality of the data is greatly enhanced centrally. We're also able to move more quickly on rapidly moving projects. We like to say that we're taking the 7-year cycle from beginning of an R01 to the publication of your first paper. We're trying to reduce that to about a year or even shorter periods of time. We're very much focused on rapid learning and rapid dissemination, and we need data that's analysis ready in order to do that. How do we get there? Well, we ask each institution to extract their data from their source systems, their source electronic health record systems, and then they locally transform the data to a common set of standards, the so-called common data model. That's what CDM stands for, a common data model. We have now moved towards monthly submissions. We have a COVID-19 surveillance project. We're also funded by the NIH to do long COVID work. And so we're currently receiving data monthly. We envision data ultimately to be stored in the cloud and updated in near real time. In order to get to rapid learning, we're going to have to continuously shorten the latency of the data submissions. The common data model is actually somewhat of a complex concept when you get down into the technical pieces of it, but conceptually it's pretty straightforward. What it does is it takes each site's local definitions, and here you're seeing the local definitions from 3 sites for place of service. And then it asks those sites to transform them to a common set of categories. And so when you are doing search, you're doing research on the common data model. So one statistical analysis will hit all the institutions in the repository simultaneously. This is another type of representation where on the left you see the institutions' source data. They're extracted, E, they're transformed to the common data model, T, and then loaded, L, ETL'd, into the common data model locally and uploaded to the Pedsnet common data repository. And there, a number of applications are used. We are focused extensively on data quality, but we've also linked the data, the EHR data, to birth records. We're going to be linking it through another study to the vaccine registries, health plan claims data. We do a variety of quality benchmarking type studies, observational research. We have studies for COVID-19, as well as we do work with CDC on diabetes, type 1, type 2 surveillance. We also can use it to identify participants for a particular type of study, a clinical trial or a prospective research study. That scenario, what we do is we execute a computerized algorithm to identify patients in the database. We pull out their encrypted identifiers, we send it back to each of the institutions, and they re-identify and recruit the patients. This has been a way to greatly enhance recruitment, particularly for rare diseases. The data that are currently stored in the repository are essentially the structured data elements in the electronic health record. They're listed on this slide. At the bottom, you can see that we are moving and have already moved into geocoding. So we don't require latitude and longitude in the repository, but we are collecting data on census block groups so that we can start linking our data to a variety of area level resources. For example, we have environmental researchers now who have just submitted an R01 to use our data to evaluate over time changes in climate and its effect on children's health. This is a national study leveraging Pedsnet data and the geocodes to see how changes in a variety of pollution markers, temperature markers, et cetera, are influencing children's health. I'd like to just touch a bit on the research that's done in Pedsnet. We do have a fair amount of demand to use the infrastructure. Here's from the beginning to where we are right now. We've had 300 requests. We're at about 112 funded studies. We're almost at 100 published papers, publish a paper about each week. We've received over the last 5 years, $130 million in grant funding. Our federal hit rate is about 58% of our studies that are submitted to federal funders are actually funded. We are at CHOP at about our capacity to do this work. Our coordinating center has 40 people working in it, but we've also started to implement a Center Without Walls model in which CHOP serves as the bearer of the standards, the technical standards, the project management standards, and institutions now are getting trained in how to serve as a coordinating center. So Stanford, for example, is undergoing training right now on all these standards so that it can serve as a data coordinating center for projects as the prime grantee with Pedsnet coordinating centers, their central coordinating center in the background. So this idea of sort of a federated model, I think, is a terrific way to grow the Pedsnet infrastructure. I think going from where we are today to at least triple the number of studies over the next couple of years. The very first we did was in that prototype, Improved Care Now. It wasn't Improved Care Now when we started. It was IBD, our pediatric IBD net. But we brought together clinicians and patients and parents and asked them what was the most important question that they have that would lend itself to research. We got a lot of ideas. A lot of them were not feasible, like how do you cure IBD? But the one that came out as really important to parents was where my kid is about either started biologic therapy, infliximab or Humira, or is about to, but there are no trials, there are no studies that compare starting infliximab or biologics, the Bs on the slide, with standard of care, thiopurines or steroids. So we said we can do that study. We could do that study in a few weeks. And so we drew this. I drew this sort of on a napkin. I said, here's the way it's going to look. We're going to find kids in the data. Some kids start biologics, some kids don't. All of the kids at the beginning of this episode, each line represents an episode of illness, will be identified based on severity. So we'll pull out the kids who are moderate or severely ill, and then we'll transform the data analytically so it looks like a clinical trial, pseudo trials. These are not randomized. These are clinicians and patients deciding whether or not to start biologic therapy. So obviously there are some inference issues, but using a variety of statistical methods, then try to control as much as possible differences between the groups, and then evaluate outcomes at 6 months. And here are the results. And so on the left side, you're looking at the y-axis is the percentage of kids who went into clinical remission. That is, they went from moderate severe to quiescent disease. The top line are kids who initiated biologics. The bottom line, kids who initiated escalated therapy, thiopurines, and steroids. And the probability of going into remission was increased by 53% for the biologic starters, or initiators. And the same kind of analysis was done, but required that people be not only in remission, but not receiving steroids. And their biologics had an even higher rate 1.73. We then took that result and we said, how does this compare to an adult randomized trial that asked the same question? Turns out there was a study called SONIC, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, that randomized adults with Crohn's disease to biologics or thiopurines and steroids. And in that study, same outcome, steroid-free remission, the rate ratio was 1.69. We've now taken this approach of replicating adult trials and doing the work using our existing data and share that with the FDA. And there's a lot of discussion now as to whether or not we can use this approach in the real-world evidence program to extend labeling claims from adults to kids. One of the groups that we've spun up and that now is moving all on its own is a nephrology group. It's called GLEAN. A number of nephrologists in the Pedsnet institutions got interested in glomerular disorders. They started their own network. It's called, and it has its own governance, it has its own leadership, but it uses the Pedsnet infrastructure. This is, we think, the model of the future. Pedsnet serving as the infrastructure for a number of networks that ask questions that they care about, that they have energy for, and these networks include not only clinicians, but also patients and families as key stakeholders. What this network first asked was, can we identify patients with glomerular disorders in the electronic health record data? And the results from that study, led by Michelle Denberg here at CHOP, published in the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology, found that the answer is yes. We could create algorithms, so-called computable phenotypes, to identify patients with high levels of sensitivity, there in the blue table, and specificity and positive predictive value. This is now been replicated across a number of other rare disorders, but it was an important first step for this network because they then took that glomerular disorder computable phenotype and applied it across the full Pedsnet database and asked the question, if we look at kidney function over time in patients with glomerular disorders versus patients with non-glomerular disorders, but both groups having chronic kidney disease, and a third group, children with malignancy who also have chronic kidney disease, is there a difference in the likelihood that they'll have major deterioration in their kidney function? We measured that through a composite outcome of achieving end-stage renal disease, dialysis transplant, or greater than a 50% reduction in kidney function. And these results are not new. In other words, this slide looks very similar to data from the prospective NIH-funded cohort study of about 1,000 kids called CKID. They found something very similar. But what was reassuring in these preliminary data for us is that we can detect signals that prospective clinical studies have found in EHR data. So you see the markedly increased rate of kidney function decline in patients with glomerular disorders in the red versus those who did not have glomerular disorder in the blue. Here's a second Kaplan-Meier plot that separates the same population into those who had no evidence of proteinuria at the initiation at the start of their observation when they entered the cohort. They are in the blue line. The red line are patients with only hypertension, the green line only proteinuria, and then the blue line both. So again, you see the profound effect on declines in kidney function having both proteinuria and hypertension. And these findings replicated quite nicely the NIH-funded CKID study. Another group that's been spun up is a group of urologists called, they call themselves PKIDs. They're very interested in understanding how to improve outcomes for children with kidney stones. Every Pedsnet institution is a member of PKIDs, but they've also extended beyond the Pedsnet institutions. And they receive funding from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute to conduct a study that contrasts the 3 different surgical approaches for removing kidney stones. When we designed the study, it was clear that there wasn't clinical equipoise among the urologists regarding whether or not which of these interventions were most effective. So we allow the clinicians to assign treatment choice. So they decide whether or not they want to use lithotripsy or conduct surgery through PCNL. But when we then use a variety of causal inference methods, we're doing a process evaluation to really understand the details of the surgery, and we've standardized the outcome to do a quasi-experimental pragmatic study on the outcomes of stone surgery. And then finally, I want to just touch on some of the work that we've done. On COVID, we've been able to really set up a COVID-19 database. We published the largest study at the time in November 2021 on acute COVID and found that 7% of kids were hospitalized. We found a case fatality rate of 0.2%. And we also were able to look at kids who were mechanically ventilated and those who were admitted to the ICU. Forthcoming in the next couple of days in pediatrics is a study that we were asked to do by the White House Task Force that got very interested in whether or not the Delta variant was associated with increased risk of severity. That is, we knew it was more transmissible, but was the Delta variant more virulent? And this slide, what you're seeing are 2 lines. On the left side of the total number of patients in our database with COVID-19, that's the solid line. You can see the pattern you've all probably seen in your own data. And then the dotted line are kids with moderate or severe illness. And we saw no evidence for increased severity, either through the Delta variant phase ending around December or even the early Omicron phase in January 2022. Finally, with Grace Lee, who was at your institution's leadership, with Charlie Bailey at our institution and myself, we've received funding from the NIH to study long COVID using EHR data. We're now in our 4th month of work. We have a paper under review that has evaluated over 400 different potential clinical features of long COVID in children and adolescents. And the approach we took with Suchitra Rao at Colorado Children's Leadership was to compare children who were PCR positive, about 59,000 kids across the institution, with those who were PCR negative. So all these kids underwent testing. We then defined the COVID observation period as day 28 after a positive or negative test all the way to about 6 months. And then we looked at a number of syndromic features, fatigue, loss of taste, smell, systemic features, myocarditis, MISC that occurs late, et cetera, and medication therapeutic classes, and ran a variety of proportional hazards models to identify features that our clinician group predicted would be associated, and then our statistics were empirically supported. Here's the set of features that we'll call syndromic features. These are all signs or symptoms or laboratory features that were diagnosed. This does not include lab results. You see changes in smell or taste up there at the top, was alopecia, chest pain up there, fatigue, only a hazard ratio of 1.18 down there towards the bottom. what we're seeing with our long COVID data is that kids who are PCR positive experience a number of features, but so do kids who are PCR negative. This is very similar to the chronic fatigue syndrome story. So as we began to look through the data here, the systemic features with Addison's disease, myocarditis, myositis up there at the top, we began to realize that we had to wash out the estimate of long COVID in those who are PCR positive with the limit or the incidence proportion of kids who were COVID negative in order to come up with a burden estimate. So when you looked at any kid who had a systemic feature or syndromic feature, and you got that rate, and then you did the same with the kids who were test negative, what we saw is that difference about 3.6%, suggesting that the burden of pass is in children is probably fairly low. We're still working on this. On the systemic side, MISC seems like it's the predominant feature, but we still have a lot more work to do, and this work will go on for the next several years. And I want to conclude with the fact that we're paying attention to building the next generation of learning health system scientists. This idea of a health professional who has clinical expertise, but knows about data science, knows about applied research, how to do pragmatic clinical trials, how to do pragmatic studies using EHR data, who knows about improvement science and implementation science. That's the content of this training program. Yara Bennett, is a member of your faculty, is a participant in this faculty development program. So we're very excited about this. We've trained now nearly cohorts. Our third cohort is entering its training program in July. So through the 5 years, we'll have trained about 30 to 35 junior faculty as learning health system scientists. So thank you very much for your attention. Again, I'm very hopeful that many of you will reach out to Keith Morris or to Grace Lee, two of your leaders there at Stanford, to find out more about how you can use Pedsnet for your own research. Thanks.